When King Arthur was, exactly. When King Arthur was trying to talk to a peasant who was explaining that we don't recognize you as a king, we're an Anarcho-Syndicalist commune. And he tried to explain that, because the Lady of the Lake granted him Excalibur, he was fit to rule, to which the Anarcho-Syndicalist, said that supreme executive power derives from mandate from masses, not from some farcical aquatic ceremony. You can't let me go around wielding supreme executive power just because some watery tart threw a sword at you.
So awesome.
Yeah, I saw that movie probably like 50 times as a kid, and then like actually saw like the only time I've seen it since I was a kid was maybe a year ago, and I was sitting there listening, and I'm like, holy shit, where did that come from? But, thanks, man.
I'm sorry, Max.
Oh, sorry.
And Chris and Brett had questions.
Oh yeah, Chris.
Yeah,
maybe go
Chris, go ahead.
first.
Yeah,
I'm
you
sorry.
first.
Well, I was wondering about policy if anarcho-syndicalism was to take place, about transparency and permanency of committees, democratically, but if someone were elected and they weren't doing an appropriate job, how would they be vetoed?
Well, again, things are to be run democratically, so whether it's in the workers' council in an individual factory or company, for example, or delegates that would be sent to the federation that's organized at the higher level. The examples I've heard of was that people that were elected to those positions would serve like a pretty limited period of time, maybe like a year, and would receive the same like pay that any other worker would. So it kind of prevented this like a privileged class from developing by having some people like Orrin Hatch, who's like been a senator for 200 years or something, and having those people make a lot of money more than just like your average worker. So that's the example that I've heard. Brett.
Well, Greg touched on my question on the historical note with anarchist Spain, but on a theoretical note, would or have there been anarchist movements that have gone through social democratic ways of protecting civil rights that have been passed? I mean, because you said they would want to do direct action with mass strikes and labor movements, and that's how they would get stuff done, so to speak. But have there been in the past gone through ways of electing mayors and stuff like that, or electing socialist people in seats to protect civil rights?
Well, again,
or they just totally
yeah, that wouldn't really be the focus to get people elected, but rather kind of like by using these other methods compel whoever happens to be in office. Which, I mean, you kind of see some of the wisdom in that from just like the experience of Barack Obama. Because I remember hearing him early in the campaign, and he had this Reverend Jeremiah Wright that he was buddies with, who was saying all kinds of great things, and so you kind of wondered, gee, I wonder if Obama's not that bad of a guy after all. And of course he gets elected, and he's just about the same as Bush, hasn't really done anything different. So again, it's the idea of not putting like really much or any faith in a particular politician. But some of the early anarchists, like again, Albert Parsons, he ran for a couple different political offices. He was even like a Socialist Party candidate for president when he was like 30 years old. And he, in his brief autobiography, which we actually published in the last issue of the Mormon Worker, he talks about becoming disillusioned after himself participating in parliament-style politics.
Right.
So.
Yeah. Well, the Barack Obama being, a socialist is one example I was thinking of. So thank you, Scott, right there.
For me, it seems like a lot of these historical anecdotes end in the following way. A bunch of people show up, they have guns, and then they shoot the anarcho-syndicalists. How do anarcho-syndicalists kind of perform either action or counteraction that results in military violence or something like that? Like, is there a way that, I mean, in Spain, like, they didn't just roll over apparently, they're fighting fascists, right? So, I mean, in what ways did they organize to defend themselves?
Yeah, I don't know like tons of details how they did that. Again, maybe Greg will want to comment. But they did have a militia, like a voluntary militia. They had, I think, maybe 120,000 fighters. The other example is Nestor Makhno, who was an anarchist who, ended up fighting against the Bolsheviks and losing, but he had an army. So, just popular militias, I guess, would be the answer. How effective they were.
How would these militias spring up from these trade union struggles?
I don't know the details of how they organized it.
Okay, maybe great. Fancy.
Well, I mean, the basic anarchist strategy, at least in Spain, and to a certain extent it was a little different in Russia. In Russia, it was everyone owns a gun anyway because you're all deserting soldiers, so you just form a militia out of it. For Spain, it was sack an armory and then pass out a gun to everyone in the union. Which actually leads into my two questions, given that there's Nestor Makhno and this Spanish anarchist. One of the critiques, which was even leveled in your, or noted in your presentation, was that the Bolsheviks had to use this excessive amount of violence, and that's the only reason they were able to maintain the regime. But the two anarchist examples used, Nestor Makhno, I would point to a recent essay by the chair of the History Department of Berlin called "Tear Them Apart and Be Done with It," the Ottoman leadership of Nestor Makhno, in which the entire movement is held together by essentially a cult of personality around Nestor Makhno and the brutal discipline through executions, guttings, throwing priests into running steam engines,
Burying alive,
burning alive, gutting, pulling fingernails, beheading, etc., as a means to maintain order in his army. And additionally, how would you respond to the fact that the violence, for example, the violence of de-Christianization in Spain, perpetrated by primarily the anarchists, which killed an undocumented amount, but certainly in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, in Spain?
Yeah. In making reference to violence, in terms of that particular presentation, it had more to do with like how the economic system continued, and especially that example, which stood out to me, under like a more anarchist conception where people aren't supposed to be forced to doing things. Whether it ends up that way in practice maybe is a different question at times, obviously. But for example, the question of collectivization of like agriculture, it was a voluntary thing. If people wanted to just like continue to work their land, they were allowed to do that. If people wanted to collectivize, they were allowed to do that. So it was based on more of a voluntary system. As opposed to this, again, the Soviet model where it was just like forced collectivization, which led to a lot of people dying. But that doesn't mean that anarchists have never committed atrocities or done bad things or killed priests and things like that. I mean, clearly as a Christian, I'm not a big fan of like murdering priests or boiling them alive or whatever else happened. So that's kind of an unfortunate aspect of, for sure, the anarchist movement, but also like the socialist movement more broadly. Even though it started out, again, giving examples like Gerard Winstanley, or like the Peasants' War that Engels wrote about. I mean, most socialism had Christian origins, and later with Marx and others took on a very atheist character. In my view, socialism or anarchism, Marxism, Leninism, whatever, should be just kind of neutral on the question of religion. So the fact that a lot of priests were killed and that I don't know is inherent to anarchism. I think it was just their, unfortunate prejudices against religious people at the time.
Can I do a brief follow-up on that?
Sure.
But, I mean, so to turn the historical question into a theoretical question, certainly Marxist-Leninists, the Bolsheviks, Mao, Castro, Che, the FARC, etc., have killed plenty of people, lots of people, lots and lots and lots and lots of people. Obviously, both anarchists and Marxist-Leninists should be said killed a lot less than capitalism does. But nevertheless, for the Marxist-Leninists, because there's a rigorous theoretical, well, just simply theorization of violence, yeah, there's bleed over, but you can see the general direction where violence goes. It goes towards landowners, it goes towards capitalists, it goes towards people concretely undermining the revolution at a particular time, whether that's withholding supplies or striking or whatever. But theoretically, it seems that anarchism has not theorized any system of revolutionary violence. And so there's just a vague conception of revolutionary violence as something vaguely defensive, so that when push comes to shove, the rubber hits the road, the theory hits the practice, because anarchism does not have a coherent theory of violence. The violence doesn't appear as any, even an unfortunately or perhaps even badly directed form of violence. It appears as a mass of spontaneous, undirected violence in the form of, to play on the words, of anarchy.